Welcome to Aircrew Interview. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this episode we chat with former F-111A and Aardvark pilot Karl Gruner. In episode 1, Karl chats about getting selected to fly the F-111, what it's like working with Wizzos, flying at Red Flag, getting selected to fly at RAF Lakenheath, getting bounced by Phantoms, and much more. So if you like what we do here and want to see more of our content and would like to support us, you can do that by donating monthly at patreon.com/Aircrew Interview. Thank you and enjoy. So Karl, when did you first become interested in aviation?
I was very, very young, probably about 6 or 7 years old. And, that's the best I can remember, but I always, not only specifically in military aviation, like my mother, when I told her I wanted to be a pilot, I was probably say 6 or 7. And she said, "Oh, you want to be an airline pilot, right?" And I said, "No, I want to fly fighter jets." So that's a vivid memory for me that I was already pretty set on flying fighter jets. So, and I grew up in France, so at that point I might have had the option, and I had dual citizenship, so I could have gone in the French Air Force actually, but I eventually ended up deciding to move to the United States after graduating from high school in France. So then I went to college in the United States, went through ROTC, a Reserve Officer Training Corps. I got my commission that way at the University of California, Berkeley, and decided to go, obviously I had to opt at this point for U.S. citizenship. And that's the way I ended up in the U.S. Air Force. But so again, very young age. My grandfather on my mother's side was very interested in aviation for some reason. He was a farmer, so there was no obvious reason why he would love airplanes, but he did, and I guess somehow it trickled down to me. Because my dad was Army, but he had nothing to do, he was like a helicopter pilot or anything. He had really nothing to do specifically with aviation. So it is what, somehow it's one of those things,
So yeah, like if you could just explain or talk about some of the aircraft you started training on and essentially what aircraft you were first selected to fly.
The way the program worked with the ROTC is the first thing that happens is in your senior year in college, the Air Force pays for 25 hours of instruction on a local aero club. So, I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area at the time. And so I went, like once a week, a couple times a week, actually, to a local aero club. And I got 25 hours in a Cessna 150 or 152, including one flight in the aerobatic version where we did the spin recoveries and, things like that you couldn't necessarily do in the regular model. And then after that, I waited to go on active duty with the Air Force, and I reported to Reese Air Force Base in Lubbock, Texas, which no longer exists. It's no longer an Air Force base. It was closed in the early 90s. But started flying the T-37 at the time, because this is 1979 we're talking about, and I graduated in 1980. So first phase T-37s, and then everybody at that time proceeded to the T-38. So I got about 100 hours in the T-37, and then T-38, we got about 120, 130 hours, something like this. At the time, everybody, all the students in the class went to the T-38. I'm pretty sure now it's no longer the case. Now the transport and tanker and bomber pilots go to the T-1, I guess. But at the time, everybody went to T-38. I did end up getting my fighter qualification, which is I'd say about half the class. I got fighter qualified, and then it was a matter of trying to get the aircraft that you wanted. My first choice really was the F-15, but at the time in 1980 there still weren't that many available, and the F-16 was even fewer. I ended up going to the F-111. So that's how, and I'd put that as my second choice, kind of as a safety thing. I really would have preferred to fly the F4, if I didn't get an F-15. And the two F-15s in my class went to the top grads, and I was pretty high, but not quite high enough. So F4 would have been cool, It's a classic aircraft, but there are too many other students that wanted to fly that. So just to edge my bet, I put F-111, and that's what I got. So, and I don't regret it. It was great. So
Absolutely, it's not a bad aircraft to be selected to
no,
fly.
no, no, no.
So,
It was fantastic. So
so what are your initial thoughts on the aircraft?
on the F-111.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, its size, I mean, it's an F-111, so it is a fighter technically, but we all know it's more like a bomber. Although, yeah, not a bomber like a B-52 or a B-1, or B-2. It's much smaller. It's I guess in that sense, it's more fighter size. And the aircraft was stressed to over 7 Gs, 7.33 Gs. So, which in most missions you never pulled close. You only pulled like 4 to 5 Gs on most missions. But it was stressed to that. Was not very maneuverable for a fighter, or if you want to consider it an F-series aircraft, but very fast. So it was pretty impressive size-wise, for one thing. The side-by-side seating, of course, T-37. That's also you had a side-by-side seating, so it was somewhat familiar from that perspective. But of course now the pilot, it was in the left seat. The weapons systems officer, or WISO, was in the right seat. And it was, to me, even as a child, I mentioned I was interested in aviation from a very young age. And so I had read a lot about the F-111 and its controversial history, had a lot of teething problems during development, but eventually matured into a very capable aircraft for its role, basically low-level, all-weather penetration and bombing. And so I was very happy. To me, it's like a really neat-looking aircraft. I just like it. Some people might think otherwise, but particularly the wings back, it just looks cool. I don't know. So, so I was very happy to report to Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho for training. And I ended up staying, the training was about 6 months, but I ended up staying at Mountain Home to go to the operational squadrons there. So I spent a little bit more than 2.5 years at Mountain Home.
Brilliant. So Karl, let's talk a bit about your ground training and working with a WISO. Were you always picked to be with one person, or were you mixed?
Well, we did have an assigned student WISO for the whole duration of the class. However, when we first started, in ground training, it doesn't really matter. You just, everybody's together in the class. And I think our class had 3 pilots and 3 WISOs, if I remember well. It's been a long time, but something like that. It's not a huge number of students, but so we had academics together, and then simulators. You tended to be with your assigned student crewed WISO. However, your first flights in the 111 were an experienced instructor pilot. And then the next few flights after that were with experienced instructor WISOs. And then more towards the end of the course, which, again, lasted 6 months or so, you did fly quite a bit with your assigned student WISO. So, as part of a 2-ship or 4-ship of F-111s, you'd be the wingman, one of the wingmen in that formation with your assigned WISO. Now, later on, when you go to operational squadron, again, you were crewed with a primary WISO, but even though they tried to schedule you with that WISO most of the time, and they did, they did a pretty good job, but you did fly with a lot of other people as well, so.
And was the 111 a desirable aircraft to be selected to? And how did the other crews in this training period? Were there was a lot of mourning and groaning, thinking, I wish I went to that one, or did you just get on with it?
No, everybody liked the airplane. Nobody was complaining, for sure. No, they were very happy to just be doing something exciting. It was a fighter, and again, fighter. Really a bomber role, but it did, it acted like a fighter in certain ways. I mean, people don't know that, but the airplane was stressed to 7.3 Gs, and I pulled 7 Gs quite a few times in the F-111. Now, most people never do that. You wore G suits. Mm-hmm. Some of the WISOs were in the habit of not even plugging the G suit, which actually was not, typically in a mission, you never pull more than about 5, on an air-to-ground mission. But I pulled 7 a few times. You just couldn't sustain 7 for very long, right? It would bleed off energy so fast that you would do it for a few seconds, and then you'd get to an airspeed where it would slow down. It had a very high corner velocity, so the speed at which you could put 7Gs was pretty high compared to other types of fighter planes. So you couldn't sustain it, that's for sure.
And let's talk. Well, if you can remember it, your first flight in the Aardvark. What was that like?
Yeah, it was pretty exciting. So, of course, I was with an instructor pilot, and it's a pretty big aircraft. You're coming from the T-38. Of course, I flew the T-38 in the undergraduate pilot training, and then also at what they called at the time, it was a lead-in fighter training lift, and now it's called IFF, Introduction to Fighter Fundamentals, but same thing. So you fly the T-38 as well, but. And then, which is a relatively small airplane, and then you go to the big F-111. It's different. It's very impressive. The acceleration on the A model wasn't all that impressive. It's comparable to the T-38, I guess. I mean, because it's a big airplane, and so the airplane, the faster it goes, the faster it accelerates, which is kind of counterintuitive. But on takeoff, the acceleration was not all that impressive. Again, I'd say it's comparable to the T-38, maybe even a little less in the A model. Now, later on, when I flew the F model at Lakenheath, that has 40% more thrust than the A model, so the acceleration was more impressive on that one.
Absolutely.
There was a significant difference. Yes, you could tell. Although even in the F model, it was nowhere close to, let's say, an F-16's acceleration. But
of course, yeah.
Still, it was good. Particularly if you took off a couple of times, I took off with a light fuel load, and that got a pretty good thrust to weight ratio, and you could climb pretty steep right after takeoff. So. And
was it correct in saying that did the A model have the same engine as the F-14 at the time?
Yeah, it's slightly different version, but yes, TF30, Pratt & Whitney TF30 turbofans, and that is exactly right. But even in the F-111, like they all had TF30s, but they were different versions of the TF30s. As I mentioned, the F model had by far the most powerful. They had about 25,000 pounds of thrust each. The A model only had about 18,500 per engine. But like there was also the D model, the E model. The Strategic Air Command at the time had the FB-111. They all had TF-30s, but they were all slightly different versions with varying levels of thrust and minor differences. But but yes, it was the same engine as the F-14.
So at the time when you were flying the A model and going through your flying training, would you be practicing dropping live weapons, and what could it actually carry at this time?
Yeah, occasionally. Now, most of the time when we went to the range, we carried these little, BDU-33 or Mark 106 training bombs. They only weigh like a few pounds, and the Mark 106 were painted orange, and they simulated the retarded weapon, so weapons that have air brakes or parachute, and actually they also simulate, nuclear weapon ballistics in some way. I mean, it's a rough replication. And then the BDU-33s were the slick bombs. They were heavier and they were painted blue, and those were replicating the ballistics, so like a slick Mark 82 roughly, bomb. Now, but we did drop on occasion. We did drop actual ordnance. Now, when I say actual ordnance, so there were two kinds. There's the actual, real bombs. And those typically were painted green with yellow bands around the nose, so that denotes the fact that these are live weapons. But that was pretty rare. Now, we did drop some occasionally, but that really wasn't very often. Now, later on, in the operational squadron, I did go to Red Flag, and we can talk about that, and did drop more live weapons. But most of the time, what we carried were weapons that replicated the exact shape and weight of the actual weapon, but they were painted blue and they were inert, so they were just full of concrete. And so, but from the ballistics point of view, they were exactly the same. From the handling of the aircraft, because they weighed the same and had the same shape, same drag, it perfectly replicated carrying live ordnance. The only thing is that when they hit the ground, they didn't blow up. Right. So.
Yeah.
But So that was, we did carry those quite a few times. In the training squadron, I don't remember doing it very often, maybe a couple of times. Later on in the operational squadrons, that happened way more often.
Mm-hmm. So how did you find working with a WISO, and would there be continuous communication between you both of you while
Yes.
on a flight?
I really liked it. Now, some of it depending on the WISO, some of them were easier to work with than others. But overall, though, great experience. I don't remember, working with one that was so bad that I would go to the squadron commander and say, I never want to fly with this person ever again. So no, that never happened. But I remember getting along. My crewed WISO, once I got to the operational squadron, was named Kurt Supan, and he was very, very good. And I would let him fly the airplane quite a bit. He ended up flying the F-16 before I did, because he got selected at some point. He was so good, he got selected to attend pilot training, and become a pilot. And then he got an F-16 out of that. And so a couple of years before I ended up in the F-16, he was already flying F-16s. But with him, I got along really well. We had a great relationship. It was fantastic. Loved it. And yes, there was a lot of communication. Now, after a while, after you got used to the WISO, maybe a little less, because you kind of almost knew what the other person was thinking or doing. But I'll say this much: during terrain following radar flights at night or in bad weather, the communication was critical. Mm. And in some cases, I mean, there have been accidents, in fact, fatal accidents in the F-111 because of that system. So it was very critical that the communication between the crew members was continuous. And basically, most of the communication in that case was the pilot the pilot was responsible for the terrain following radar scope and monitoring that, and the WISO had his head mostly in the attack radar. So the terrain following radar would sweep vertically in front of the aircraft and basically follow the profile and automatically fly the airplane up and down over the mountains. And then the WISO had the attack radar, which swept horizontally. But in case the terrain following radar had a malfunction, the WISO could tell, also in a way, in a less accurate way, but accurately enough that he could tell if we were getting too close to a mountain, and that if we continued, we would impact. And basically, if you're below a peak, the attack radar would start having a black cone behind it, because the radar cannot see on the other side of the mountain. So the return is just this black cone. And if the cone gets getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, that means you're below the peak of that mountain. And so if the terrain following radar, typically one of the key calls was when we got like about 2 miles, which was only like 15 seconds, before impact, before the mountain, because we were going typically 8 miles per minute. So at 2 miles, the WISO would say, you call 2 miles, when he would say that the peak of the mountain's at 2 miles, and then we should start pretty soon seeing the terrain following radar react to that and bring the aircraft up to pass over the ridge or over the peak. And of course, we did that mission, that was our primary mission, so we did it quite a lot. Compared to later on the F-16, the proportion of night flying in the F-111 was quite high. It wasn't quite half, but it's probably about 40% our flights were at night.
So let's talk about the wing sweep, and how did you find this function? And also, I've always wondered, so when the terrain following radar is engaged, do you still have to manually sweep? Do you still have to keep, or is it right? Yeah, it's
always manual. It's not like the F-14 at all. And the Tornado is the same way. It's manual. So the front, where the wings forward, it was 16 degrees at the leading edge angle. All the way back is 72 degrees. You had detent, so there was a lever on the left side of the cockpit, which was only available to the pilot. And that, what we used, forward on the lever was the wings forward, and back was the wings back. And there were a couple of detents, one at 26 degrees, which was mostly like 26 degrees was our more like cruise, long range endurance, best wing sweep. And then one at 54. And the one at 54 is important because under certain configuration of ordnance on the wings, if you had ordnance on the inner pylons, so the pylons keep aligned with the aircraft no matter what the wing sweep is, so they swivel. Now, the inner pylons were close enough at the 72 degrees that you could actually crush, have the weapons impact the fuselage if you had, depending on what your load was. So for certain weapons configuration, you were limited to the 54-degree maximum sweep. And so there was a detent to block it. And you had to manually, push a different button to override that. Right. So typically on most missions, we'd rarely go beyond 54 anyway. Although there was exception when we go supersonic at red flag, exiting the target all the way back to 72, going 1.3, 1.4 Mach right on the deck. But typically, like the 45-degree angle, there was no detent for 45, but 45 was kind of a very good compromise when you were flying at 480 to 540 knots at low altitude. 45-degree angle was most of the time that's what we used.
But yeah, let's talk about your first Frontline squadron and where was this based and what kind of flying would you be doing?
So the first operational squadron, I went to training in the 389th training squadron at Mountain Home, and then I stayed at Mountain Home and just moved across the street, so to speak, to a different squadron, the operational squadron, which was the 390th at the time. And I think I mentioned the 390th, after about a year that I was in a squadron, they became the first F-111 squadron. And I was not transitioning to the EF, so they moved me, and this is not even across the street. It was like the building next door. It was the 391st Fighter Squadron, a Tiger Squadron, Bold Tigers. And now they still exist. They're flying F-15Es now at Mountain Home. But so I spent another year in the 391st. As an operational crew member. I was still a young lieutenant, but still, went to Red Flag and did some pretty cool, deployments to Florida, to MacDill Air Force Base to do some exercises, participating in a number of large exercises. It was very exciting for a brand new guy, brand new lieutenant. One of my most memorable missions was my first Red Flag mission, which was just amazing.
You have to share that then.
Yeah, well, now we did have an orientation sortie, when we first showed up to just show us the range, which, so it was not an operational, tactical mission. It was just kind of like flying around and, like, don't go in Area 51 kind of thing, because that's right, and say, well, do not go in that box because bad things will happen. Okay. But then the first tactical mission that I was sent on, I was supposed to be a wingman in a two-ship of F-111s, and we get to the end of runway last check before takeoff, and my leader has a problem and says, I have to abort. I can't go fly this airplane. I can't remember what the exact problem was. And, like in the F-16 later, that would have meant the wingman aborts at the same time. Not in the F-111. They said, you go. I'm like, what? Now, I did have my good Wizzo friend, Kurt Supan, who was an experienced Wizzo. He was experienced. So, I felt okay. So at least he knows what he's doing. But it was pretty exciting. So, we took off as a single ship. Not grand, yeah, single ship. We were part of a large package with, RF-4s, F-15 escorts, other F-111s that were later, but in different flights, some F-4s. I can't remember the whole composition. Probably some F-4Gs, Wild Weasels. In any event, I've got a TOT, time on target to meet, and that's what we're going to do. We hit the tanker first, and then we ingress, on time, and but I'm by myself, basically. Again, there are other airplanes in the area, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm going to be striking my target at my time. And that's what happened. But it was, because we were looking for threats. There, of course, it was red air trying to get us, and we were flying really low. And so because I was, I guess a little nervous about it. My load was 6 BDU 33s, so those practice bombs, not the big bombs, but just and I was supposed to ripple them like it's like 0.2 second interval, so it took like 1 second to drop the whole thing. And I failed to hold the pickle button long enough, right? So the pickle button is on the stick, and it's a red button, and you push, and it releases the bomb, assuming you have the master arm on and the right weapon selected. So instead of dropping the 6, I think I only dropped like 2 bombs because I didn't hold it long enough to in my excitement, I thought, okay, I'm done, and I started worrying. So we noticed that. And so we re-attacked. So I went around and came back and dropped the rest of the bombs. But that was kind of exciting. Now, it was all planned that you did have a couple of minutes for a re-attack. So, that wasn't. And then on the Egress, now, when I hit my TOT, I had been preceded by maybe a minute or 2 by an RF4 pre-strike recce. On the way back, we caught up with him, and he was going supersonic, like maybe 1.1 Mach, but we were going so fast, we were going like 1.4 Mach. And it sounds like a lot, but you have to remember Nellis is at about 5,000 foot elevation, so it's not like sea level. Like sea level, the max speed was really about 1.2, but at 5,000, you could get to about 1.4. And so even though this RF4 is already going supersonic, we're catching up with him, and we're just passing him like he's not standing still, but like it was like easily. I mean, it wasn't even close, because we're going like a couple hundred miles per hour faster than he is, And we're like at 300 feet on the deck, if that. I don't remember if I was checked up to 100 feet, a low altitude at the time. I don't think so. I think I was still limited to 300 on that mission.
And then you also flew in Lakenheath. As you mentioned before, you flew the F model. Can you tell us about this and your experiences of flying there?
Yeah, my 3 years in the UK were some of my best years ever. First of all, I loved living in the UK. It was great. So, and then Lakenheath was an awesome base. The F-111F, again, had a couple of major differences compared to the A model. I already mentioned the extra thrust, which was very significant and very good. It didn't translate in that much more of a maximum speed, and that had to do with the fact the air intakes were bigger, so the frontal area of the airplane was a little bit bigger, but it did translate to much faster acceleration, particularly at the lower speeds. So, and the other thing, the big difference, it had the paved tack system. So this was one of the very first. It wasn't the first, because already in Vietnam, there were infrared laser targeting pods in service. Early generations, they were pretty crude compared to what we have now. But the paved tack was the first one that was quite sophisticated, very, very good infrared picture, and that allowed us to self-laze laser-guided bombs. So. In the A model, we actually occasionally, now I don't remember doing it myself, but occasionally we would carry laser-guided bombs, but you had to have somebody else laze for us in the A model. We did not carry a pod ourselves. Now the technology at the time meant that to get a really good picture and good performance from a laser targeting pod like this, the pod was actually pretty big. And what they did in the F model is they put it in the weapons bay area. So it sacrificed the weapons bay. You could no longer carry weapons in the weapons bay, which we didn't do anyway in the A model. The Strategic Air Command version, the FBs, did that, but we didn't in the tactical world. And the paved tack was pretty big, and it rotated, so you could stow it when you weren't using it, and then the tracking ball would rotate out, and then you could slave it basically underneath the belly of the airplane, 360 underneath, and that allowed us to guide our own laser-guided weapons, which was very, very useful. So that was pretty exciting, because that was something new for me. And of course, flying in the UK was also quite different than in the US. In the US, you have these pre-planned routes that you have to kind of stick. No, these are corridors, so you can maneuver inside the corridors. And then sometimes there are military training areas and military operating areas, MOAs, where you can more or less do what you want. But in the UK, you could fly, unless it was like, cities. I mean, there were areas where you couldn't fly, but other than that, you could fly everywhere else. So we fly typically from Lakenheath. Because of the range of the aircraft, our favorite training area was over Scotland, because there were fewer populated areas. There were more mountainous terrain, so it was more realistic training for us. It was more challenging. We had the opportunity to fly at night there in the Highlands restricted area. So we went to Scotland quite often. I can't tell you how many Loch Ness runs I've done. It's like, I don't know, dozens. But that was one of the favorite, routes, is to go fly over the Loch Ness. And then we used the various ranges, everywhere in the UK. I remember I think it was like 6 or 7 ranges that we used regularly, in the Wash area. Along the east coast, there were a couple of ranges, and there were a couple of ranges up in Scotland. I think close to Lossiemouth, there was a Rose Hardy range. I remember that one because that was the one range that was operated by a civilian contractor, and he was quite friendly to us as far as giving us good scores. But so he had a good reputation, and we like to go to that range. But so it was very interesting. You would plan your routes and fly. You could fly at 250 feet everywhere. And some areas were down to 100 feet. Although typically that was reserved for the RAF. But still, it was excellent flying. And occasionally we'd fly on the continent. So I flew like over France, we would use some of the bombing ranges in the Netherlands. And in Germany also, so no, it was exciting times. And I'd say the range of the aircraft allowed us to go pretty far from base. So there was excellent souvenirs of those 3 years of flying in the UK.
And did you ever fly or train with the RAF? Did you get bounced by Phantoms, tornadoes, anything like that? Can you tell us a few stories there, Karl?
Yes, of course, you get bounced by. Now in the 111, of course, if you get bounced, you were allowed to do a defensive turn or something, but you couldn't. And then you'd rock your wings, saying, "Hey, basically knock it off," because our way to get away would be speed, but you couldn't go supersonic at low altitude over the UK, and that was not. So we were limited in that sense, and so eventually they did put AIM-9s, but although it wasn't something that was commonly done, but they did say, okay, well, you can carry AIM-9s, but I actually never did. So we didn't have like a defensive armament. We had no gun. So we were pretty limited in that sense. Not a couple of times in the Wash ATA, when the weather was bad at low altitude, I would maybe doing an instrument ride or something, but I'd go to the Wash ATA and do some handling, just by myself, because in between cloud decks, so like the low altitude, you couldn't go out because the weather was just too bad. Mm-hmm. And I'd be bounced by a kind of Royal Air Force F4, and then for me I was pretty aggressive. I know, of course, I knew I had no chance, but I would engage into some maneuvering just to practice my defensive, like gun breaks and things like that, and even starting with a neutral, particularly at 20,000 feet. Like if we were closer to the deck, maybe I still wouldn't have a chance, but. And I'm sure these F4s, it's only happened a couple to 3 times, but they probably didn't even have to use afterburner, but after like less than a minute, they'd be on my tail, and there was nothing I could do about it. But so, there was never any doubt that, and I never was engaged in that kind of, turning fight by like an F-16 or something. That would have been not even funny, but even against an F4, it wasn't close. Yeah. Yeah. The aircraft just wasn't designed for that. It just wasn't. It wasn't. In the real world, what you do if you were bounced at that altitude, you would have to get down to the deck as soon as possible. Full afterburner, go down supersonic. Maybe you have to jettison your weapons. Maybe, hopefully not. But if you have to, you have to, and then go supersonic and try to escape that way. Mm-hmm. That was basically what we had to do.
And you probably have many, but can you maybe share a few memorable stories from your time on the F-111?
So the one from my first right flag mission but it was very memorable. But other than that, one of the things we really enjoyed when I was at Lakenheath as well was flying in Turkey at Incirlik Air Base, and using the Konya range.
Mm-hmm.
That's always very enjoyable because again, in that 50-mile circle around Incirlik, we could do whatever we wanted in there. Well, I mean, within reason. Obviously, you couldn't go supersonic on. You could over water. You could go supersonic, but it was you had basically from ground to 50,000 feet up, and so. Unlimited. Unlike in the UK, where 24,500 was the start of the positive control area, so the PCA, which you have to be under radar control above that. Mm-hmm. But at Incirlik, you could go up to 50,000, which was our limit anyway. I mean, the airplane could go higher than 50,000 technically, but because we're not wearing pressure suits, there was a restrictions just because of that. Mm-hmm. Now, as far there's a lot of memorable stories, but one of the things that was interesting about the F-111, for one thing, was the ejection capsule, which was now I never ejected, but I knew a few people who did, so that was interesting. And then the fact that the capsule could float, in case you ejected over water, that meant that we never had to wear the immersion protective suits like many pilots have to do, like if they're going to fly for any length of time over cold water. So that was something that was really excellent about the F-111. Is the capsule allowed you to eject at supersonic speeds if necessary without dying, because typically on a regular ejection seat, I don't care how good the seat is, if you eject supersonic, you're probably going to die. I mean, there has been like a couple of cases of people surviving. I mean, they stayed in the hospital for like 6 months, but at least they survived. But in the F-111, that was not a factor. You were fine. And one of the memorable souvenirs I have, is the squadron exchange with the Belgian Air Force at Florence Air Base in Belgium, and they were flying Mirage 5s at the time. Later on, they transitioned to the F-16, but that's the second wing at Florence. And we brought a few F-111s there for about 2 weeks, I think it was. And we flew in Belgium on air ranges and flying low altitude. And as part of that exchange, I got to fly in the backseat of a Mirage 5 for one flight, which was very enjoyable. So it's, it was backseat, but I still got plenty of stick time. And that was a very interesting aircraft. It had very basic systems, almost nothing. So it was very visual only, very fast aircraft. In the pattern, it was much faster than the F-111, because the F-111, big airplane, but with the wings forward, you were actually very reasonable approach speeds, on landing and things like that. But the Mirage 5 had much higher approach speeds and landing speeds because of the delta wing. And these were great times. The Belgians were fantastic. Obviously, they had flying rules that were a little bit more lax than ours. They would do things for which we probably would have been probably not court-martialed, but got into severe trouble anyway. And for them, it was like no big deal. Okay, but so
get on with it.
It was. And of course, because I spoke French, and Florence is in the French-speaking part of Belgium, I was very popular there because I spoke their language. So.
Absolutely. But it sounds like you've had a great time on the F-111. But you said you just missed your 1,000-hour patch, didn't you?
Yes, just. I had like 975 hours.
Oh, so close.
Yes, it was very close. So I broke my finger in 1983 while skiing. And I had a cast on for a while, and then there was a little bit of rehab. So I think it was about 6 weeks I couldn't fly. And that probably would have made the difference.
Yes, definitely.